Chicago's deadliest gang that turned EBK before any other gang, the Satan Disciples. It was past 10, maybe closer to 10:05, and the block was quiet in that way it gets right before something crazy jumps off, like the air's holding its breath. A car pulls up slow, headlights off, creeps past the old rusted gate. Someone steps out, hoodie up, no words, just tension thick enough to choke on. Two men wait in the shadows. One used to call the other his brother, but tonight the only thing standing between them is a loaded clip and some history that can't be undone. Earlier that evening, they had sat around the same table, arguing over the future of a crew that had already buried too many. Now, one of them didn't walk away. No names, no sirens yet, just footsteps down a narrow gangway, a click, and then silence. You want to understand how this all started? You gotta take it way back before the colors, back before the devil horns, back to when Pilsen wasn't even a Latin neighborhood yet. In the late 1950s, Chicago's Lower West Side was a whole different story. Pilsen, Little Village, all those areas were packed wall to wall with working class Polish, Czech, and Slovak families. This was fresh off the Great Depression and World War II, and folks came looking for factory jobs, steel mill shifts, union pay, and some kind of peace. By 1948, Pilsen was close to 100% Eastern European, and the blocks were held down by Catholic parishes, immigrant social clubs, and neighborhood pride. It wasn't all good though. These were hard neighborhoods with hard rules. Kids didn't hang around on corners for nothing. You either earned respect or kept your head down. Streets like 18th, 24th, California, and Oakley, those corners taught you fast that outsiders weren't welcome unless you were with someone from the block. Now around the same time, a different wave was creeping in. Mexican-American families, mostly pushed out of near West Side neighborhoods by housing projects and urban renewal bulldozers, started moving into Pilsen and Little Village. At first, it was just a few houses here and there, then a few blocks. By the early 1960s, Latinos were setting roots heavy. But let me keep it real. Multiculturalism wasn't in style back then. You had Polish families who looked at the new Mexican neighbors with suspicion, and the tension got thick quick. Fights broke out over turf, side-eye glances turned to punches, and just walking through the wrong alley could spark something ugly. This was before the city started paying attention, before there were gang units and community peace summits. Back then, young boys had to figure things out themselves. That's where it started. In 1959, a group of about 12 Polish teenagers formed a crew just off 15th Street and Talmadge. They weren't trying to run no corner yet. They just wanted to keep outsiders off their block. They picked a name meant to scare people off the bat, not for some satanic worship, but just so folks wouldn't try them. The name was the Satan Disciples. Now here's the twist. A local priest had actually called them that first, tried to shame them into straightening up, saying they were acting like the devil's disciples. Instead of feeling insulted, they took that name and ran with it, wore it like armor. You got to understand, back then a gang name was like a neighborhood badge. You didn't need guns or colors. Your name was enough. At first, the SDs were all white kids, Polish, Czech, maybe a few Slovaks. They weren't built around violence or drugs. They were more like a street fraternity. They had meetings, collected dues, and even wrote their own rule book. That's right, they had bylaws. Rule number 1, loyalty. Rule number 2, get a job. Be productive. Stay out of jail unless it was for protecting your brothers. You could work in a factory, open a tire shop, be a firefighter. Just don't become a cop. That was the only job they didn't respect. And they had structure. The top guy was called King. He was elected, not appointed, and had to be reasonable. Someone the others trusted to make calls without getting caught up in petty drama. They believed in self-defense, not first strikes. If you threw hands, it had to be because someone tested you first. That code kept the peace, at least for a little while. But here's where it gets real interesting. While other white gangs in Chicago were quick to throw fists at the new Mexican kids moving in, the SDs decided to do something different. They opened the doors. By the end of that first year, they were already about 50% Mexican, and that right there was rare. This wasn't some feel-good unity movement. It was just the block evolving. Polish boys and Mexican boys realized they had the same problems. No money, no protection, no respect. So they said, screw it, let's stand together. The neighborhoods around them didn't get it. Other white gangs like the Gaylords or Ambrose were still stuck on old turf beefs and racial lines. But the SDs, man, they were thinking survival. And if building with the Mexican kids meant having more backup, more reach, more pull in the streets, then that's what they were going to do. With that change, the gang started to grow. They opened up new sets at 18th in California, 14th in Washtenaw, and 18th in Oakley. Those corners became satellite bases, places where the name Satan Disciples started to carry some real weight. They fought off rival cliques like the Latin Counts and Ambrose, and they held it down against the Gaylords, who didn't like how SDs were switching the game up. Even their symbols started to evolve. The SDs embraced a cartoonish baby devil with a pitchfork, something that made their name feel real, but also kept it tongue-in-cheek. The devil wasn't about worship, it was branding. Later they adopted the 6-point star, baby horns, and colors like canary yellow and black. But early on, it was just loyalty and identity, and that rulebook, it stuck around for a while. They still encouraged members to work legit jobs. Some ran auto shops, some did landscaping, some worked on construction crews by day and handled block business at night. The dual life was just part of the game, but nothing stayed simple for long. As the gang got more Mexican and the city around them changed, the original code started getting tested. Younger members didn't always want to follow the old school rules. The neighborhood was getting rougher, the economy was breaking down, and respect in the streets was turning more about how far you were willing to go. The SDs were growing, yeah, but they were also about to hit some crossroads. By the time the early 1960s rolled in, them blocks that the Satan disciples called home were starting to feel a little different, because now it wasn't just about holding down your set with your brothers. It was about protecting what you had from crews who didn't care nothing about your rulebook or your history. The Latin Counts were already rumbling through 18th Street, the Ambrose gang was posting up near Marshall Boulevard, and the Gaylords was moving shady through spots like 18th and Western. But it wasn't until 1964 that a real heavyweight crew made its entrance into SD turf, and that was the Latin Kings. The Latin Kings wasn't just any new gang showing up with spray cans and pocket knives. They were coming in organized and aggressive, looking to recruit fast and claim ground even faster, and they didn't always ask nicely. They had roots on the north side, but by the mid-60s, they set their sights on Pilsen, and they was hungry for it. They started sending squads down past the train tracks, crossing into Satan disciple land like it was nothing, and trying to pull young heads away from the SDs with promises of power, protection, and the kind of unity that sounded good to kids with nothing. The problem was, the Satan disciples wasn't built for offense back then, because their whole foundation was based on that original code. Defend your block, don't start nothing, and stay loyal to the set. So while the Kings was running up in broad daylight with bold tactics, the SDs was still trying to hold their ground by following the book, even if that meant taking L's from time to time. Some folks inside the gang started whispering that the old ways was making them look soft, and that maybe it was time for a different kind of energy to lead the charge. That energy showed up in the form of a young cat named Agapito Villalobos, but folks on the street didn't call him by his government name. They called him Big Aggie. Now, Aggie wasn't the type to wait around for permission. He was born and raised right in the middle of Pilsen, and from early on it was clear he had that fire in him, the kind of fire that don't like sitting still. While most of the older SDs were still pushing that defense-first mindset, Aggie was out there already sliding into enemy zones solo, marking up walls, swinging on rivals, and making a name that traveled faster than any chain of command could keep up with. One of his boldest moves was setting up his own SD set right on 24th Street in Washtenaw, which was smack in the middle of contested territory, a place where Latin Kings and Latin Counts had already tried to make inroads. But Aggie didn't care, because he lived on that block. His mama stayed right there on the same street, and he wanted the SDs to have their flag flying high, right outside his own front door. That kind of move was wild at the time, because it broke every line in the original rulebook. But it hit different with the younger generation, especially those who was tired of feeling outnumbered or outmaneuvered. It didn't take long before more young SDs started gravitating toward Aggie's way of thinking, seeing him not just as some reckless hitter, but as someone who understood what it took to survive when the game was changing. This was the start of the real shift, a slow grind away from those peaceful beginnings, toward a mindset where protecting yours started to mean taking someone else's. And even though the top brass wasn't officially co-signing every move Aggie made, they wasn't exactly stopping him either, because he was getting results, and that spoke louder than tradition. Meanwhile, the makeup of the gang itself was changing too, and not just in how they operated, but in who was running with them. A lot of the original white members, mostly Polish and Czech cats, started peeling off, either getting drafted into Vietnam, moving their families out to Cicero and Oak Park, or just feeling like the neighborhood wasn't their spot anymore. Some of them got pulled by the Gaylords, who was pushing that white unity thing, and one prominent SD, named Kingfish, even flipped sides entirely, taking a chunk of white members with him to the Gaylords, setting up shop around 18th and Western. As those white members bounced, the SDs started looking more and more like the streets they lived on, and by the late 60s, they was predominantly Mexican-American, repping the same culture that had been moving into Pilsen since the 50s. That ethnic shift wasn't just about who wore the colors, it was about how the gang saw itself, who it was fighting for, and what kind of future it was planning to chase. The rule book didn't get thrown out overnight, but it stopped getting followed page for page, and instead, It became something older heads quoted when they felt like reminding people what the gang used to be. And while that transformation was happening in the alleyways and on the stoops, the city itself was changing too. By the time the 1970s started winding down, it was clear to everybody in the Pilsen and Little Village sets that the old way of running things was slowly disappearing, and the streets were starting to choose who they wanted to follow next, because even though the name King Canary was still holding rank on paper, more and more heads was looking to Big Aggie to call the shots. Aggie wasn't asking for permission either, because he had already proven that he could post up wherever he wanted and hold it down. So by 1980, the vote was made official, and the title of King passed from Canary to Aggie without much resistance. Now with Aggie officially crowned, the energy inside the Satan Disciples changed completely, and the way they operated went from neighborhood brotherhood to street empire mentality, because Aggie wasn't interested in holding down just a couple blocks in Pilsen. He wanted reach, presence, numbers, and enough territory to make SDs a citywide force. They started setting up new sets outside the usual zones, and before long, they had sections in the heart of Chicago, back of the yards, and even suburban corners like Cicero, Aurora, Bridgeview, and West Chicago. These weren't just satellite crews either. They were full SD chapters collecting dues, repping the Baby Devil logo, and answering back to the main structure. And that structure was growing fast. Each set had a prince or local boss, and they all kicked up to King Aggie at the top, who kept a tight circle of enforcers to make sure nobody got greedy or tried to go rogue. That kind of system don't just build itself though. So Aggie started making key alliances too, connecting with crews like the Ashland Vikings and Harrison Gents, and in some cases, even linking up with the maniac Latin Disciples and Milwaukee Kings when it made sense to lock a corner down. Now, while all that expansion was happening, the war with the Latin Kings didn't stop, not for 1 second, because that beef was still deep and bloody, especially along the dividing lines in Little Village and West Pilsen. You also had growing static with 2-6 and Ambrose, both of which used to be enemies before the Folk Alliance came into play. But some sets never fully trusted each other, even after the alliance papers got signed inside Stateville. Back in April 1978, a major sit-down went down behind bars at Stateville Correctional Center, where the heads of Chicago's top street organizations started building what would become 2 major umbrellas: the Folk Nation and the People Nation. Larry Hoover of the Black Gangster Disciples was the one who pulled most of the strings to make it happen, and the idea was to stop all the random prison beefs and build structure both inside and outside. The Satan Disciples joined the folk side, mostly because they already had a decent relationship with Hoover's crew, and the move opened up a whole new lane of power for them. Joining the folks wasn't just about politics, it came with a whole mindset, and Aggie grabbed that and ran with it, bringing back a constitution that laid out how the SDs would function from that point forward. The big feature in that constitution was what they called free enterprise, which basically meant that any member could get money however they wanted, legally or otherwise, as long as they sent a cut back to the set. This was a straight-up business model, and it matched what other folks were doing, like the Gangster Disciples and Black Disciples who had already been moving like syndicates for years. Under Aggie's direction, SDs started stacking money both clean and dirty. And if you were smart, you could open up a car wash, a used tire shop, a corner taco joint, or even run landscaping for suburban clients, all while funding gang meetings and protection crews on the side. A lot of the older guys loved that setup because they didn't have to be on the block hustling every day, and it gave them a reason to keep things stable instead of wilding out. But it was the younger heads who brought in the fast cash, and for most of the mid-80s, the SDs was deep in the heroin and weed game, especially in spots like 51st and Wood, 18th and California, and even Bridgeport, where they flipped a whole section of the mighty projects into a new SD turf. As the 80s moved along, crack cocaine hit the streets, and just like every other major gang in the city, the SDs jumped in head first, with runners on corners, stash spots in trap apartments, and lookouts on rooftops. The way they moved drugs was cold and organized. You had youngins in middle school serving as lookouts, teenage runners making drops, and older members playing the muscle, collecting payments or taxing non-SD dealers who tried to move on their blocks. Some of those same kids who used to just tag walls and walk dogs was now moving serious product. And once that fast money came in, it got harder and harder to get them to listen to any kind of old school discipline. Meanwhile, the SDs was pushing heavy branding too, making sure everybody knew exactly who they were and what they stood for. The Baby Devil with the pitchfork became a stamp you saw everywhere, spray painted on garage doors, etched into desks at public schools, drawn in notebook margins by kids barely old enough to ride bikes alone. The six-pointed Star of David got adopted from their Folk Nation ties, and yellow and black became the official colors that told people who ran that block. By this time, the Satan disciples had their own holidays too, with May 3rd being locked in as Nation Day, a date when members would gather, throw parties, make speeches, and sometimes hold community events to show the neighborhood they wasn't just about drugs and violence. On the surface, it might look like a gang flexing, but to the people inside, it was like a family reunion, a celebration of their history and structure, even if that structure was built on turf battles and power moves. And let's not forget, by the mid-80s, they were so deep that it wasn't uncommon to see entire families tied to the gang, with older brothers running the sets, younger cousins serving as lookouts, uncles handling legit businesses that laundered money, and mothers who turned a blind eye as long as the bills got paid. This wasn't just a clique anymore, it was an institution, one that had grown from a handful of Polish teens into a Mexican-American machine touching nearly every part of Chicago's southwest and west sides. By the time the mid-80s rolled around, the name King Aggie had already traveled through every block where the Satan disciples had set up shop. And whether folks loved him or feared him, everybody understood that he wasn't the kind of dude who asked for respect, he just took it. But in 1983, all that expansion, all that loud movement, and all that street fire finally caught up with him because Aggie got hit with an armed robbery charge that stacked on top of his previous felony. And once the judge threw the book at him, he was sentenced to 12 years in an Illinois state prison, locked away just when the SDs was really starting to feel untouchable. Now here's the thing about the Satan disciples that set them apart from some of the other gangs that ran Chicago at the time. They had a rule that said if you wasn't outside, then you couldn't lead the crew. And that wasn't just a suggestion. It was baked into the way they thought about power. They didn't believe in running things from behind bars because they felt like a locked up leader couldn't see the street for what it really was. And if he couldn't post up, slide on a corner, or meet face to face with the young heads, then he shouldn't be calling shots from a jail phone. So once Aggie got taken out the picture, the leadership seat didn't stay empty long, and the man who stepped into that role was Danny Valencia, who most people in the hood called Gizmo, a name that didn't exactly scream gangster at first, but anyone who knew him understood that he had presence, discipline, and a mind sharp enough to keep the whole set from crashing out. Gizmo wasn't trying to be the next Aggie either, because his style was calm, measured, and quiet in a way that made people listen, and that made him stand out even more during a time when most gang bosses was yelling, swinging, or flexing on every block. He came up in the same streets as the rest of the crew, mostly around 18th and Oakley, but instead of always trying to prove he was the wildest one in the room, Gizmo had this way of watching everything first, then moving with intention. And when the vote came up to pick the next king, a lot of older members pushed for him because they were tired of all the reckless heat that came with Aggie's expansion game. Gizmo was about stability, and for a gang that was getting too big to control without organization, that kind of mindset made sense. As soon as he took the throne, you could feel the shift happening, because Gizmo started pushing everybody to tighten up and focus back on the things that used to make the SDs feel like more than just a crew. And he brought up the original rule book like it was gospel. He talked about education, about finding jobs that paid cash under the table, about not shooting unless there was no other way out, and about taking care of the neighborhood in a way that didn't leave it looking like a war zone every weekend. Under his leadership, members started getting their GEDs again, not because they wanted to be schoolboys, but because Gizmo said that being smart in the streets meant knowing how to move with options. And some cats even got trade jobs in construction, electrical work, and city contracts that let them earn without having to duck cops every day. And it wasn't just talk either, because Gizmo was leading by example, showing up to block meetings with clean shirts, work boots, and notes in his hand about what needed to be fixed. Of course, not everybody was feeling that switch up, especially the younger heads who had come into the gang during Aggie's reign, because they were used to the action, the money, and the thrill that came with hustling heavy. To them, Gizmo sounded like somebody's uncle telling them to stay in school and stop wilding out, and for some of them, that wasn't what they signed up for. This is when that quiet divide started growing between the older workers, who were trying to build something steady, and the younger hustlers, who just wanted to stack fast and flex harder. Still, Gizmo didn't back down from his vision, and even though the drug business was still part of what funded the operation, he made it clear that sloppy dealers or loud clowns weren't going to be the face of the SDs under his watch. He told his top guys to clean up their spots, keep the peace when possible, and build alliances that didn't leave bodies in alleys every week. And somehow, some way, the gang started to balance itself again. Expansion didn't stop either, but it got smarter. New sets popped up in spots like Gage Park and Brighton Park. And one of the most solid examples of that expansion was the Spalding set at 59th, which was started by a cat named OSO, who used to be with a gang called the Ridgeway Lords, but flipped over to the SDs after seeing how Gizmo ran things. That move wasn't just about turf, it was about loyalty and vision, because OSO brought a crew with him and locked down the corner, holding it firm against Latin Kings from Crown Town, who tried to push them out early on. Even though the set was new, they moved like vets, and Gizmo made sure they had the support they needed, not just in soldiers but in structure, because he didn't want wild branches popping up without roots. And that was the difference, because Gizmo didn't just want the SDs to grow, he wanted them to last. During this era, the alliances they had with other folks stayed intact for the most part, and even though tensions still lingered between some of the older rivals like Ambrose and 2-6, Gizmo kept communication lines open, made sure local leaders were staying in sync, and tried to keep the gang from falling into the kind of inner beefs that destroyed other crews from the inside out. He wasn't trying to be friends with everybody, but he wasn't trying to make enemies where there didn't need to be none either. People in the neighborhood noticed the difference too, and even some of the older residents who had cursed the gang under their breath in the 70s started saying that things felt more stable under Gizmo. You didn't hear gunshots every other night anymore, and some blocks started getting cleaned up a bit, with younger kids allowed to ride bikes without always looking over their shoulder. Now don't get it twisted, the SDs was still a gang, still pushing product, still collecting taxes from their sets, and still moving with the street code. But under Gizmo, there was a level of control that gave them power without chaos, and that was rare. Most gangs either blew up or broke down, but Gizmo was building a middle path, and for over a decade, he kept the throne with steady hands. By the late 80s, you had a whole generation of SDs who only knew Gizmo as king, and even though some of them had heard stories about Aggie and the wild days before, most of them saw Gizmo as the real example of leadership. He was the one who kept them from turning on each other, the one who made sure they didn't get wiped out by city sweeps or neighborhood backlash, and the one who reminded them that being in a gang didn't mean acting like fools. By the mid-80s, under Gizmo's leadership and the structure left behind by Aggie's aggressive groundwork, the Satan Disciples had become a full-blown operation with reach way beyond just the city. And you started seeing that baby devil tag showing up in places where nobody expected it, like in the back alleys of suburban towns and the bus stops outside strip malls. Sets started popping up heavy in spots like Cicero, where the older white crews like the insane popes and the bishops used to hold it down. But now them blocks was shifting, and SDs was moving in through family connections and quiet takeovers. In Westmont and Downers Grove, which used to be sleepy suburbs full of middle-class white families and softball leagues, you suddenly had SD members showing up in schools, repping yellow and black, building sets out to apartments where uncles or cousins had moved in from the city. In Aurora, which was starting to deal with its own gang issues around the mid-80s, the SDs didn't wait for permission. They just set up shop and claimed their space, using old neighborhood ties, and a strategy where family trees and bloodlines moved just as much weight as corner soldiers. The way they spread wasn't all loud and flashy either, because some of that expansion came from what gang researchers started calling the familial gang transplant effect, which was just a fancy way of saying that when a gang member moved to a new spot, they usually brought the whole crew with them over time, and sometimes all it took was one funeral, one cousin moving in, or one fight at school for a new SD set to get born in a suburb that thought it was safe. Meanwhile, back in the city, things wasn't slowing down either, because the turf wars in places like Westtown, Brighton Park, and Gage Park was heating up like never before. In Westtown, the SDs had beef with the C-Notes and the insane Spanish Cobras, but it was the Milwaukee Kings that brought the most drama, especially near Division and Ashland, where both crews wanted the same corners. That same tension existed in Gage Park, where the Spalding set was holding it down against Crown Town Latin Kings, and Bridgeport was turning into a quiet battlefield, with SDs slowly pushing into territory where Irish and Italian crews had tried to keep things closed off for years. One of the wildest examples of that expansion was the creation of a set they called Sleepy Hollow, which locked down a stretch near 43rd to 48th Street, close to Midway Airport, and that area had been mostly white working class for years. But once Latinos started moving in and getting harassed by racist crews like the Insane Popes, the SDs moved in fast to offer protection and set up a stronghold. That set didn't just survive, it flourished, and it became a model for how SDs could move into new areas and build without always starting off with bloodshed. Another set that got recognized heavy during this time was No Love City, which operated near 18th and Western, and the name came from how cold it was out there. Not just from rivals, but from the environment itself, because the cops stayed riding through, landlords didn't fix nothing, and the gangs around the area was quick to fire before they asked questions. No Love City became known for having soldiers who moved quiet but violent, and it held down that part of the West Side longer than most people thought possible. Internally, the SDs was moving like a proper organization now, with every local set having its own leader, usually called a prince, or section chief, who was in charge of collecting dues, passing down orders, and making sure the bylaws was followed at least in spirit, even if some of the younger ones didn't read nothing past the parts about money and loyalty. Those dues went up the chain to the central leadership, and even though Gizmo was trying to keep things chill, he still expected every section to contribute to the war chest, the funeral funds, the stash for lawyers, and the street operations that kept the whole thing running. During this period, some sets started pushing back on the old alliances that had been made under the Folk Nation banner, especially when it came to groups like the Harrison Gents and the Ambrose, who at different times had been allies, rivals, or straight up enemies, depending on which set and which block he was talking about. These alliances wasn't built on loyalty alone. They were based on profit, location, and pressure, and that meant they could flip quick if someone crossed the line or started undercutting another crew's business. There was still pressure from the Latin Kings too, especially in neighborhoods like Little Village and Pilsen, where the boundaries between sets was tight and patrols walked up and down with eyes wide open. The conflict between SDs and Kings had been running for 2 decades already, and even though both sides was part of the bigger political landscape of Chicago gangs, that didn't stop local flare-ups from turning deadly whenever someone stepped over a line or disrespected the wrong corner. Some of the Folks Alliance partners started showing cracks too, and there was a moment when the 2-2 boys, who had once been part of the Insane branch with the SDs and 2-6, decided to step away after issues that popped up in 1992, leaving the alliance less stable than before. That exit caused other sets to reconsider who they trusted, and the result was a whole lot to street-level diplomacy being handled by set leaders who wasn't always trained to be politicians. At the same time, gentrification started rolling through places like Pilsen, where developers and landlords began pushing working-class families out to flip properties into condos and boutiques. And that shift started making it harder for some SD sets to maintain the kind of strongholds they had in the 70s and early 80s. The rent went up, the neighborhoods got more police attention, and in some cases, entire buildings that used to house multiple generations of SD families got bought out and cleared, breaking up some of the most solid lines of loyalty and communication that had held the gang together for years. Even with all that change though, the SDs during this period became one of the biggest Latino gangs in the city, and not just in name or body count, but in terms of infrastructure, reach, and influence. They had members in CPS schools, in Cook County lockup, in local businesses, and even in city departments where somebody's cousin might be working quietly, just passing info back to the block. What made them different from some of the other crews was how they blended their street presence with structure, and how they let each set operate with a little autonomy, as long as dues got paid and disrespect wasn't shown to the main line. They used coded language, hand signs, and a whole set of signals that let them communicate across neighborhoods without ever sending a text, and they knew how to fall back when needed, especially when police heat got too heavy. In the mid-80s through early 90s, SDs had solid numbers, deep loyalty, and a reputation that wasn't based on rap songs or TV portrayals, but on real-life stories of fights held down, corners taken, and family protected. They wore yellow like armor, flashed the baby devil like it was a badge, and treated Nation Day like a holy weekend. And even the city started taking notes on how deep this crew had really gotten. By September 1995, the streets of Pilsen looked real different than they did back in 1983 when King Aggie got locked up. And even though his name still echoed through alleyways and old heads still told war stories about the sets he built and the corners he claimed, the truth was a whole new generation had come up that didn't really know him like that, and they wasn't ready to bow down just because someone said he used to run things. After doing 12 years flat, Aggie came home expecting to walk back into the throne like it was still waiting on him, but the world he returned to had already been reshaped by the hands of Danny Gizmo Valencia. Gizmo had kept the gang together for over a decade, guided it through expansion, held the peace when things got hot, and earned real respect not through fear, but through discipline and care. And the young SDs that filled the ranks by the mid-90s had been raised under Gizmo's steady hand, not Aggie's fire. So when Aggie touched down and started making noise, trying to step back into the king role like no time had passed, the reception wasn't as warm as he expected, and some of the set leaders barely even knew the man outside of stories and whispers. Now by street code, Aggie had a claim, because technically, he never got voted out or expelled. He just lost the crown when he got sent upstate, and some of the older members felt like tradition said Gizmo should step aside and let the original king return. So out to respect, that's exactly what Gizmo did, at least on paper. He didn't argue, didn't cause drama, just slid over into the number 2 spot and let Aggie wear the crown again. But what Aggie didn't understand was that paper titles didn't mean much if nobody was willing to follow your lead. As soon as Aggie started trying to run things, he saw quick that the streets had moved on. And it wasn't just about loyalty to Gizmo, it was about how Aggie was moving. Folks said he was acting like it was 1982 again, expecting people to salute without question. demanding dues from every set like it was a tax season deadline, and spending money on personal beefs instead of looking out for the crew. Rumors spread that Aggie had plans to restart a war with the Latin Kings in Little Village, not because there was an immediate threat, but because he wanted to show the gang that he was still a soldier worth following. These moves didn't sit right with a lot of the younger set bosses, especially the ones who had spent years under Gizmo keeping things quiet and profitable, because they wasn't trying to get caught in a pointless war just to boost Aggie's image. Complaints started floating around behind closed doors, with some members saying they didn't like how the monthly dues they was collecting from their sets was getting rerouted into hit money and retaliation squads that nobody asked for. The tension started building like pressure in a kettle, and even though Gizmo was trying to stay out the way and play his role, more and more soldiers kept coming to him instead of Aggie when things needed to get done. And that right there told Aggie everything he needed to know about who really held the throne, regardless of what the title said. The disrespect wasn't always loud, but it was clear, and it was constant, like when crew leaders ignored Aggie's calls or pushed back on his orders, telling him that the streets didn't move like that anymore. That built-up resentment reached a breaking point on November 1st, 1995, when Aggie called for an all-set meeting at his house on West 24th Street, pulling in close to 15 leaders from different parts of the city, including some old friends and a few younger bosses who had been giving him the most resistance. He told everybody to show up at 6 p.m. sharp, made it seem like it was just a sit-down to clear the air, but folks knew it was about more than just talking, because things had already started spilling into the streets, and a power decision had to be made. The meeting started off cool, just folks sitting around Aggie's dining table, talking about dues, turf issues, and the usual day-to-day. But it didn't take long before voices started rising and tempers started showing. One of the younger leaders, a dude who had earned his stripes under Gizmo's rule and wasn't scared to speak on it, stood up and said what a lot of others had been thinking. He told Aggie straight up that if he didn't switch up the way he was moving, they was going to take a vote and re-elect Gizmo as king, official or not. That room went dead quiet, like every word had hit the walls and stuck. And even though nobody else spoke up right then, it was obvious that the kid wasn't speaking for himself alone. Aggie didn't say much after that, just nodded, stood up and ended the meeting without yelling or threatening. But everybody in that room could feel the weight in the air, because when a man like Aggie gets challenged in his own house, in front of his own table, with that many eyes watching, you know he didn't gonna let it slide. Later that night, Aggie sat alone in that same room, going over everything in his head, feeling the sting of betrayal and humiliation, realizing that the power he thought he still had was gone the moment that young member spoke up. He wasn't the king no more, not really, and that meant he had two choices: fall back and watch the empire move without him, or make a move that would shake the whole structure to its core. And the street's been knowing for a long time now which option he picked, but back then it was all whispers and side glances, just folks noticing how cold Aggie got after that meeting, how he stopped taking calls, started making moves in silence, and kept asking questions about Gizmo's habits, his routines, his hours. Some folks tried to convince themselves that it wasn't what it looked like, that Aggie was just venting, just riding out the disrespect until things cooled down. But deep down, they knew something was brewing, and it wasn't just about loyalty no more. It was about pride, legacy, and power. Aggie started plotting, and the play he was building wasn't about negotiation or compromise. It was about removing the one man standing between him and total control. And in the world they came from, removing somebody didn't mean sending them out to town. It meant taking them out for good. He waited till the streets got quiet, till the emotions from the meeting faded, till folks stopped talking about votes and started talking about money again. Then he picked up the phone, dialed Gizmo's number, and told him they needed to talk, one-on-one, no drama, no crew, just two kings trying to set things straight. And Gizmo, being the kind of man who believed in conversation before conflict, said he'd come through, not knowing that he was walking into a setup that had already been put in motion, brick by brick. It was already dark when the call came in, sometime around 9:40 p.m. And even though the weather that night was calm, there was a chill in the air that didn't come from the wind, but from something in the atmosphere, like the streets already knew what was about to go down before it happened. Gizmo was at home, probably finishing dinner or going over notes for the next crew meeting, when the voice on the other end told him Aggie wanted to talk, just the two of them. No soldiers, no tension, just closure. Aggie said they needed to clear the air to squash whatever confusion was left after the meeting at his house. And even though the warning signs were there, Gizmo wasn't the type to ignore a direct request from a man he used to call his brother. They had built too much history together, fought too many wars side by side, and shared too many nights laying out plans in the same kitchen to believe that one phone call could flip the script completely. So without hesitation, Gizmo grabbed his jacket, grabbed his keys, and told whoever was home that he'd be back in a little while. Around 10 p.m., his car pulled up near West 24th Street, just a few houses down from Aggie's place, and he parked like he had done so many times before, feet hitting the concrete with that same steady pace he always moved with. He wasn't rushed, wasn't paranoid, just focused, probably running the conversation through his mind, thinking about what he needed to say and how to keep the peace for the sake of the crew. He walked down the side entrance, a narrow gangway between houses where the porch light barely reached, and as he stepped further in, past the chain-link gate and toward the side door, two figures emerged from the shadows. There was no time for talking, no time for questions, just movement, and then a flash. Gunfire tore through the quiet like thunder, a short burst that echoed off the brick walls and left smoke hanging in the cold night air. Neighbors said they heard maybe 3 shots, maybe 4, but by the time anyone looked outside, the alley was silent again, and Gizmo was laying on the concrete with his jacket soaked through, a pool spreading out beneath him, and no one standing over him to explain why. News traveled fast in Pilsen, and before sunrise, the whole hood was buzzing with confusion, pain, and disbelief. Some people didn't even want to believe it, thinking maybe it was another rumor, another lie spread by rivals. But by morning, the truth had settled in, and it hit hard. Gizmo, the king who had kept things solid for over a decade, the one who held the gang together when everything else was falling apart, was gone, taken out on the street he used to walk with confidence. The funeral came quick and it was heavy, with members from every set showing up to pay respects, from Sleepy Hollow to Spalding, from No Love City to Brighton Park. They didn't wear suits, they wore their colors, yellow and black, with some wearing shirts printed with Gizmo's face, and others just showing up silent, standing on the curb with heads low and fists clenched. No one needed to say what they was thinking, because they all knew it didn't feel right, it didn't feel fair, and it didn't make no sense. What made it worse was the way the whole thing smelled from the start, like someone on the inside had made the call, like this wasn't just a random hit, but a hit built on betrayal. And eyes started turning real fast toward the man who had called Gizmo there in the first place. But when police came knocking on Aggie's door later that week, he wasn't home, and nobody knew where he had gone. Turns out, just hours after the hit, Aggie had caught a flight out of Chicago and landed in Dallas, Texas, staying with extended family like he was just taking a break from the drama. The move didn't sit right with anybody, not the streets, not the crew, and definitely not the detectives, because the hit had gone down on Aggie's property, and if it wasn't him who pulled the trigger, then it was somebody close enough to be trusted in his yard. That kind of proximity meant something, and the cops knew it, which is why they started digging into phone records, tap lists, and neighborhood tips until one name kept popping up again and again: Trejo, known in the streets as Vicious, Aggie's right-hand man since back in the early expansion days. Vicious had been riding for Aggie since before the suburbs even knew what SDs were, and when they pulled him in and started pressing him on where he was that night, his story didn't hold up. Forensics tied him to the scene, and witnesses started talking, maybe not loud, but just enough to get him indicted. In court, the evidence stacked heavy against Vicious, and with pressure coming down from both the police and the public, he got sentenced to 30 years, leaving no doubt that somebody in Aggie's inner circle had pulled the trigger. But what about Aggie? He eventually came back to face the case, and when he did, everybody thought it was open and shut, like this was finally the moment when he'd be held responsible for what the whole crew already knew he had set in motion. The trial started, testimonies were lined up, and the spotlight was on. But then the unexpected happened. The key witness, a neighbor who had claimed to see Aggie near the scene that night, took the stand and changed her story, saying she couldn't remember clearly anymore, saying the darkness made it hard to identify faces. Why she flipped, nobody can say for sure. Some said she got scared, others said she got paid, and some even said she got visited late at night by people who made sure she understood what was at stake. Either way, without her testimony, the case fell apart, and Aggie walked out the courtroom a free man. Not because he was proven innocent, but because the system couldn't hold him. But just because the law let him walk didn't mean the streets did too. The damage had already been done, and the trust that had once glued the sets together was gone. SD members started looking at each other sideways, wondering who was loyal, who was next, and who had known the plan before it went down. What used to be a tight brotherhood started cracking from the inside, and it all came back to that one night, that one call, that one alleyway, where loyalty bled out onto the concrete. Aggie never regained his position after that, not really. And even though he walked free, he walked alone. The throne he tried to reclaim ended up cursed by the very move he made to secure it, and the ghost of Gizmo stayed in the wind, haunting every corner where SDs used to stand strong, whispering a warning about pride, betrayal, and how fast a king can lose his crown when he forgets who put it there in the first place. After Gizmo got dropped, it was like the soul of the whole operation got ripped out and left in that alley with him, because once the funeral ended and the court let Aggie walk, the real damage started showing up where it hurt the most, right on the blocks where the soldiers used to stand shoulder to shoulder. With no central leader and no trust in the chain of command, every set started acting like its own little kingdom, and the Satan disciples stopped moving as one, starting to crumble in slow motion. Aggie thought he could reclaim the streets after he beat the case, thought he could come back and talk to the sets like nothing happened. But the younger generation wasn't buying it, because no matter what the court said, everybody in the hood already made up their mind. They knew what had gone down. They knew who made the call, and they knew who disappeared. The second things got hot. So when Aggie tried to come back and issue orders, he got straight ignored or shut out. And just like that, his second run as king died before it even got started. Without a leader that everybody could trust, the structure collapsed, and it didn't take long before the cracks turned into full-blown breaks. Sets that used to work together started moving like strangers, collecting dues but not sending them up, making their own decisions without asking for clearance, and posting up without backing up neighboring blocks. Pilsen didn't speak for Gage Park, and Gage Park didn't answer to West Town, and you started seeing small beefs pop off over turf, over taxes, over product, or just over pride. Some of them splits turned deadly, and next thing you know, you got SDs shooting at SDs in neighborhoods like Brighton Park, Little Village, and even the Burbs, where cousin sets used to share the same colors, but now move with different rules. One crew might still be trying to follow the old constitution, while the other just wanted to move weight and protect their own corner. And if one stepped into the other's path, it was war, no matter what flag they wore. Once the unity broke down, the Folk Nation alliances started falling apart too, because the SDs used to move in sync with other folk crews like the 2-6 and Maniac Latin Disciples. But now the calls wasn't coming through clean, and some sets just stopped answering. There was no more centralized negotiation, no more sit-downs at neutral corners, and the peace agreements from the 80s didn't mean much when every SD set was making its own calls. When shots started flying between SDs and their old allies, it sent a message to the rest of the city. The folk umbrella wasn't holding no more. It was around this time that you started hearing a phrase that didn't exist in the early rulebooks, but captured exactly where the SDs was heading: EBK, short for Everybody Killer. At first it was just street slang, something dudes whispered when they didn't care who got hit, as long as they got paid or got their respect back. But soon, it turned into a full-blown mindset, a way of moving where loyalty didn't matter, politics didn't matter, and alliances got tossed to the side the moment they stopped being useful. The young heads embraced it hard, especially the ones growing up without a clear set of OGs to guide them. And instead of building unity, they built firepower. They started wilding in public, making reckless moves, and prioritizing drug money and personal beefs over structure or legacy. If somebody disrespected them, it didn't matter if that person wore the same colors, because EBK meant it was up for anybody. This way of moving would eventually bleed into the drill era of Chicago rap, where EBK became a term used in lyrics, tags, and block anthems. But the truth is, that energy had already been born years before the music made it famous. It started in the aftermath of Gizmo's murder, when a gang built on protection and unity fell apart from the inside, and the only thing left to replace it was chaos with no rules. After the walls caved in, the Satan disciples didn't disappear, they just scattered, and what was once a single powerful structure turned into fragments spread across the city and suburbs. Some sets kept the old ways, sticking to codes and collecting dues with respect, while others moved like freelancers, using the name for clout but answering to nobody. In spots like Cicero, Aurora, and Gage Park, SDs still held corners, but the order that once made them feared and respected was mostly gone. By the 2000s, gentrification started pushing longtime members out of Pilsen and Little Village, replacing brick flats with condos and art spaces, and as families moved out, sets either relocated or faded, leaving behind graffiti tags and faded memories of when the baby devil ruled the block. Some members transitioned into legit hustles, running auto shops, security firms, or even holding community positions, while others stayed in the game, pushing weight and posting up like the 80s never ended. Their legacy shows up in drill lyrics, gang murals, prison networks, and stories told from stoops to jail cells. But ask any old head, and they'll tell you the peak ended the night Gizmo got dropped. After that, everything felt borrowed. That brotherhood they built in the 50s, that empire Aggie grew in the 80s, that order Gizmo held together through calm and crisis, all of it cracked. The second loyalty got replaced by pride. And in the same gangway, where it all turned to dust, the silence still hangs thick, like it remembers what happened, like it knows the cost of a crown chased too long.